The voicemail was 11 seconds long. I played it 3 times standing in my driveway before I went inside. "Hey, it's Naomi. I know it's been a while. I'm getting married next month, and I just needed to hear your voice. Call me back if you want." "You don't have to." I stood there long enough that my neighbor's dog started barking at me through the fence. "My name is James Calloway. I'm 41 years old and I restore old furniture for a living. Not antiques, not the kind people pay a fortune for at auction houses. The everyday kind. Dressers with broken runners, dining tables with water rings scorched into the wood, rocking chairs that wobble because someone sat in them every day for 30 years and loved them past their limits. I work out of a converted garage in Asheville, North Carolina, and I've been doing it since I was 26, first as a side job, then as the only job, then as the thing that kept me functional when everything else fell apart. I live alone in a craftsman bungalow on the west side of town. 3 bedrooms, one of which I use for storage, one of which I've never once figured out what to do with. I have a workshop out back, a dog named Hitch, who is mostly shepherd and entirely useless as a guard dog, and a front porch that faces a maple tree that turns a particular shade of orange every October that I have never gotten tired of looking at. After the divorce, I didn't change much about the house. That surprised me. I thought I would. Repaint hallway, rearrange the living room, do the kind of thing people do when they're trying to make a space feel like theirs again. I didn't do any of it. I moved her clothes out of the closet and left everything else exactly where it was, including the lamp. It's a floor lamp, the kind with a linen shade and a weighted base, a brushed brass finish that's gone slightly warm with age. Naomi bought it at an estate sale in Weaverville, the first fall we were together. She drove 40 minutes to look at it, paid $60 and wrestled it into the back of my truck herself. When she got it home and plugged it in and the light came on, she stood there in the middle of the living room like she'd done something that mattered and said, "That's the exact color a room should feel like at night." I have turned that lamp on every evening since, even the evenings I didn't want to. Even the evenings I sat in the chair beside it and didn't read, didn't watch anything, just sat there while Hitch snored on the rug and Asheville went quiet outside the windows. I never asked myself why I kept it. I didn't need to. Some things you hold on to not because you forgot to let go, but because letting go would mean admitting the thing is gone. Naomi and I met when I was 29. She was running a booth at a craft fair on Lexington Avenue, handmade ceramics, mostly mugs and small bowls with uneven glazes and colors that flutters like weather. I bought a mug I didn't need because I couldn't think of a reason to keep standing at her table and I needed one. She figured that out immediately and laughed at me, and I decided I wanted to hear that laugh as many times as possible. We were together 4 years, married 2 of them. The marriage didn't end because of anything dramatic. No affair, no betrayal, no event you could point to and say, "There, that's where it broke." It ended the way a slow leak ends a good tire, quietly over distance until one morning you realize you're driving on the rim and have been for a while. Naomi wanted to move, not just houses but lives. She'd grown up in Asheville and somewhere in our 2nd year of marriage she started talking about Seattle, Portland, maybe Austin. She wanted a bigger art scene, more opportunity for her ceramics, a version of her life that hadn't already been decided by geography. I had a workshop, a client base, a community that took a decade to build. I didn't want to start over. We didn't fight about it. We just stopped being able to see each other's future, and that gap, quiet and civil as it was, turned out to be too wide to stay in. We signed the papers on a Wednesday. She hugged me at the courthouse door. I drove home, walked into the living room, turned on the lamp, and sat in the chair beside it until it was dark. That was 3 years ago. I'd heard through mutual friends that she'd ended up in Charleston, South Carolina, not Seattle or Portland or Austin, that she was doing well, selling her work through a gallery on King Street, that she'd met someone, a name I didn't retain, a detail I filed away in the part of my mind reserved for things I'd decided not to think about. My friend Ray was the only person who called me on any of it. Ray runs a hardwood flooring business 2 blocks from my shop. He's 53, divorced twice, and constitutionally incapable of pretending a thing is fine when it isn't. One afternoon he stopped by the workshop, watched me sand the same corner of a credenza for about 10 minutes longer than any corner needed, and said, "You turned that lamp on again last night, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. I told him I turned it on every night. He picked up a scrap piece of walnut from my bench, turned it over, set it back down. "James," he said, "you've been divorced 3 years, you haven't been on a single date, and you keep a floor lamp your ex-wife picked out like it's structural to the house. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying that's a thing. I told him I liked the lamp. He left without pushing it. But the thing about Ray is he says what he's going to say and then walks away and lets it sit in the room after him. The observation stayed in my chest for the rest of the afternoon. The way a splinter sits in your finger, not debilitating, just noticeable enough to remind you. So when I stood in my driveway listening to Naomi's 11-second voicemail, the first person I called wasn't her. It was Ray. I told him what she'd said. He was quiet for a second then. "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know. He said, "Yeah, you do." I called her back. She answered on the second ring like she'd been holding the phone. We talked for almost an hour, which surprised both of us, I think. She was in Charleston. The wedding was in 6 weeks. His name was Derek. She mentioned it once and then didn't again, which I noticed. She asked about the workshop, about Hitch, whether the maple tree had started turning yet. She sounded like herself, and also like someone doing a careful impression of herself, just slightly off in pitch. The way a song sounds when it's being performed by someone who learned it phonetically without knowing the language. Near the end of the call, she said, "I've been thinking about Asheville a lot lately. About the house." I asked her what specifically. She said, "The lamp, actually. Is it still there?" I looked across the living room at where it stood beside the armchair, its shade glowing the exact color she'd described the first night she plugged it in. I told her yes. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I'm glad." 3 days later she called again, then texted, then asked if she could come up for a weekend before the wedding, just to see the mountains, she said, just to breathe the air before things changed. I said yes, and I didn't examine the yes too closely. She arrived on a Friday afternoon in a blue Honda, with a crack in the windshield she said she'd been meaning to fix for 2 months. She looked the same, and also different, in the particular way people look when they've moved through a period of their life you weren't present for. Her hair was shorter. She was carrying a ceramic mug in her cup holder, one she'd made herself, deep green glaze, slightly lopsided in the good way that means it was thrown by hand. She walked in the front door, looked around the living room and stopped. "You didn't change anything," she said. "No," I said. Her eyes moved to the lamp. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you'd forgotten you missed. We ordered takeout that night. Thai food from a place on Merrimon that hadn't existed when we were married. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours, and it was unsettling how easy it was, how fast the particular rhythm of a conversation with someone who knows you came back, like water finding a channel it carved years ago. She laughed the laugh, more than once. At some point she told me about the wedding. The venue was a restored plantation house outside of Charleston. Derek had insisted on it. The guest list was 240 people. She knew maybe 60 of them. The dress had been chosen with input from his mother and 2 of his sisters, a process she described with a specific flatness in her voice that told me more than the words did. She said it's beautiful, the way people say a house is in a great location, when the house itself isn't what they wanted. I didn't push. I didn't ask a follow-up question. But I noticed the same thing I'd noticed on the phone. The way she said certain words carefully, held them at a slight distance, like she was quoting from a document she hadn't drafted. She stayed 2 nights. Saturday we drove up to the Blue Ridge Parkway and hiked a section of trail we'd done a dozen times when we were together. The leaves weren't fully turned yet, just starting, that first week of color when the edges of things go gold before the whole tree commits. She walked ahead on the narrow parts and waited for me on the wide ones. At one point on an overlook that faced west into Tennessee, she said without any particular lead-up, "Do you ever think that we just gave up too fast?" I stood beside her looking at the ridgeline. "Sometimes," I said. "Do you?" She didn't answer. She pulled her jacket tighter and we walked back. That night after dinner we sat on the front porch with the lamp casting its warm light through the window behind us. She had a glass of wine. I had a beer. Hitch had arranged himself across both our feet, which he does when he decides a situation requires his supervision. She turned to me and said, "I want to ask you something and I don't want you to read too much into it." I told her to ask, "Are you happy?" Like actually, not fine happy. I thought about it. "I'm peaceful," I said. "I don't know if that's the same thing." She looked at me like I'd confirmed something she'd been trying to prove to herself, and not in a comfortable way. "Derek is the opposite," she said. "Everything is big with him. Big plans, big events, big feelings described very loudly. And there's something compelling about that." There was. "But lately it just feels like..." She stopped. "Noise," I said. She looked over. "Yeah." Her phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. She looked at the screen. Her whole body changed, just slightly, just a tightening across the shoulders and jaw. She silenced it and set it face down. "He checks in a lot," she said before I could not ask. "Is that what he calls it?" She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Sunday morning I made coffee. She came downstairs while I was still in the kitchen and reached past me to get a mug from the cabinet. Third shelf, right side, same place they'd always been, without pausing to look. Her hands still knew the kitchen. I watched her notice that and not say anything about it. We sat at the counter with our coffee and the Sunday quiet, and at some point she looked at the lamp through the kitchen doorway and said, "I need to tell you something." She told me that Derek monitored her location. Not obviously, not with anything he'd announced, but she'd figured it out 3 months ago when he'd referenced a coffee shop she'd gone to without telling him, in a neighborhood he had no reason to know she'd been in. She'd brought it up and he'd explained it away. Something about sharing their phones for convenience, something technical and reasonable that she'd almost believed. She told me his financial accounts were separate from the shared ones she had access to. She didn't know what he made. She'd never seen a tax return. When she'd asked about it, he'd called her anxious and changed the subject with such smoothness that she'd spent an hour afterward wondering if she was in fact just anxious. Her ceramic work, which a gallery in Charleston had started carrying and which was beginning to do well, he'd suggested she scale back. Not demanded, suggested, with a kind of reasonableness that was very hard to argue against because it was never quite specific enough to grab. The studio space was expensive, he'd pointed out. The time she spent on it was time she wasn't spending on what they were building together. He'd said it with a smile, the way someone says something they know they could get away with saying. She looked at her coffee mug, his mug from his house, from a matching set his interior designer had selected, and set it down. "I don't know which drawer the batteries are in," she said. "In his house. I've lived there 8 months and I've never found where he keeps the batteries." I knew what that meant. "Naomi," I said. "I know," she said. "You're not anxious. I know." She left Sunday afternoon. At the front door she stopped and looked back at the lamp the way you look at something you're memorizing. Then she looked at me. "Thank you for letting me come," she said. "I needed to see if it was still here." I said the lamp wasn't going anywhere. She smiled, and it was a complicated smile, and she walked to her car. I stood on the porch until her taillights were gone. Ray was leaning on my workbench Monday morning when I got to the shop drinking coffee from a thermos, clearly having let himself in with the key I'd made the mistake of giving him years ago. I told him she'd come and gone, he said. And I told him what she'd told me about Derek. He was quiet for a moment, then set down his thermos. "Does she have people there, in Charleston? People who aren't his?" I thought about it. I didn't have a good answer. He reached into his jacket pocket and set a business card on my workbench. A family attorney in Asheville, someone who'd handled his second divorce, a woman he described as meticulous and completely unintimidated by men with money. "I'm not saying call her," Ray said. "I'm saying have it." I put the card in my breast pocket. The next 2 weeks Naomi texted regularly. Nothing that named what was happening. Nothing that said, "I'm reconsidering, I'm afraid, I'm not sure." Just small things. A photo of a bowl she'd thrown that morning. A question about whether the grocery store on Merriman still carried the specific pasta she liked. One evening just, "I played piano today for the first time in 8 months. Forgot how much I missed it. I didn't know she'd stopped playing." That detail sat with me. Naomi had played guitar since she was 12. Not professionally, not even particularly ambitiously, just for self in the evenings the way some people take walks. It was a habit as fundamental as breathing, and she'd stopped. I wrote back, "Why'd you stop?" She wrote back, "Didn't fit." I stared at that for a long time. 4 weeks before the wedding, she called me at 11 at night. I was in the workshop finishing a rocker I'd been putting off. I picked up covered in sawdust. She didn't say hello, she said, "If I came back to Asheville, what would that look like?" I set down the piece of sandpaper I was holding. "What do you mean came back?" "I mean if I didn't go through with it. If I just came home." I noticed she said home and I didn't correct her. I said, "It would look like the lamp's still on." She made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cry or both, the way things are when you've been holding a feeling too long, and it finally finds a seam. She said, "I'm scared, James." I said, "I know." She said, "I built myself around something that might not be real." I said, "Then we figure out what is." She didn't call Derek that night. She called her sister in Knoxville, a fact she told me later. And then she called the attorney whose card I'd photographed and texted her 3 days earlier. What came next wasn't clean or fast. Derek did not respond to her, leaving the way a reasonable person responds to hard news. He responded the way someone responds to losing control of an asset. He called her twice in 1 hour, then her sister, then a friend of hers from their shared social circle in Charleston, running a version of the story that positioned him as the injured party. So efficiently, it was clear he'd prepared the version in advance. Her gallery contract was for work she owned outright, and he had no claim to any of it, but that didn't stop his attorney from sending a letter implying otherwise. The letter was specific and technical, and clearly designed to make her feel like the logistics of leaving were too complicated to survive. She called me the night she received it, shaking a little in her voice. I told her to call the attorney in Asheville. She already had. What Derek hadn't counted on was that Naomi had been slowly, quietly separating her finances for 4 months. Not dramatically, not in any way that would register as anything other than normal banking, a savings account she'd opened with earnings from the gallery, a few months of expenses she'd built up carefully and without announcement. She'd been moving toward the door for longer than she'd admitted to herself, and some part of her had known enough to prepare. She moved back to Asheville in October. I didn't help her move. I made that decision deliberately. She'd found a studio apartment in the River Arts District, a 1-bedroom above a printmaking cooperative, small and bright and entirely hers. She signed the lease herself. She arranged her own furniture. She set up her pottery wheel in the corner by the window and threw her first bowl in the new space the same day she got her keys. She texted me a photo of it. I texted back, "Looks like somewhere you'd want to come home to." She sent back a single line, "You remembered." Every Sunday morning I left a bag of groceries on her doorstep. Good olive oil, the pasta she liked, fresh fruit if the market had anything worth getting. I sent a text that said front door and I didn't knock. Some Sundays I sat in my truck for a minute after, looking up at her window, and then I drove away. It was the kind of restraint that isn't comfortable, the kind where what you want and what someone needs don't line up yet, and you have to trust that eventually they will. She started seeing a therapist on Tuesday afternoons. She mentioned it once, simply, the way you mention something that's just true now. She got her guitar out of storage. She joined a small ceramic collective in the neighborhood, 3 other makers who shared a kiln and strong opinions about glazing temperatures. She went to Thanksgiving at her sister's in Knoxville and came back saying it was the first holiday in 2 years she'd spent with her own family. I did not see her for 6 weeks. Then one Sunday in November, my front door knocked at the usual time I would have been leaving groceries at hers. I opened it and Naomi was standing on the porch holding a paper grocery bag. She said I made too much soup. I looked at the bag. I said, "That's not soup," she sighed. "No," she said. "I also brought bread and that cheese you like from the market on Lexington." She looked up. I might have been planning this for a few days. I stepped back from the door. She walked in. She stopped in the living room the way she'd stopped the first time she came back, and looked at the lamp. But it wasn't the same look. The first time she'd looked at it like a question. This time she looked at it like an answer she'd already received, and was just confirming. She set the bag down and walked to the lamp and ran her thumb along the edge of the shade. The way you touch something you've been thinking about when you finally get to touch it. "You kept it," she said. "It's a good lamp," I said. She turned around. Her eyes were bright, not in a crying way, in the way of someone who has been in a small room for a long time and just opened a window. "I went back to playing guitar," she said. "Tuesday nights mostly, just by myself. But I'm thinking about joining a small group that plays at the coffee shop on Walnut. Open mic kind of thing. Nothing serious." "Do it," I said. "Derek thought it was embarrassing," she said. "Not the playing. The wanting to play for people. He said it was a little." She made a gesture with her hand that didn't need completing. "Do it anyway," I said. She looked at me for a moment, and then she went to the kitchen and started making soup. I found myself beside her, the same way I'd always ended up beside her in a kitchen, not because someone directed it, just because that's where the gravity went. She opened the right cabinet for the stockpot without looking, reached for the cutting board leaning against the backsplash without asking where it was. Knew the pepper mill was above the stove because that's where it had always been. Her hands knew this kitchen. She let them. We talked while she cooked, not about anything important at first. Ray's ongoing campaign to get me to adopt a second dog. The printmakers downstairs who played extremely loud music on Thursday mornings. the maple out front, which had peaked 2 weeks ago and was now down to mostly bare branches. Then she said, while she was stirring, I called my gallery contact in Charleston last week. She's going to start carrying more of my pieces. Larger inventory, better placement. She said it quietly, but with a solidity under it, the kind you build yourself. That's great, Naomi, I said, and I meant it with my whole chest. She looked over her shoulder at me. I think I'm going to be okay. I know you are, I said. I've known that for a while. We ate at the kitchen table with Hitch arranged optimistically below us, which was new because he'd apparently decided Naomi warranted the full welcome. After dinner she stayed to wash dishes. I dried. Her shoulder against mine at the sink was the same as it had always been, warm and familiar without any performance in it. At the door leaving she turned back to look at the lamp one more time. Then she looked at me. Same time next Sunday, she said. I'll leave the bag, I said. No, she said. I meant I'll come here, if that's okay. I said it was more than okay. She came back the next Sunday, and the one after. February came, and the maple in front started showing the first green at its tips, which in Asheville means winter isn't quite done, but has stopped meaning it. She brought her guitar one evening and played for an hour on the porch, while the last cold light went over the mountains, and Hitch fell asleep against her ankles, which was, I realized, a form of editorial opinion. There was no single conversation where we named what we were doing. No moment where I said, I love you, come back, this is what I want. It didn't work that way. It accumulated, the way things do when you're paying attention. Sunday soups, Tuesday texts, her guitar, her laugh, the lamp between us. One evening in March she arrived for dinner carrying something wrapped in a piece of canvas. She set it on the kitchen counter and unwrapped it. It was a lampshade. Linen, brushed off white, a close match to the original. The old one's getting worn, she said. I found this at the estate sale in Weaverville. Same sale, actually. Different booth. I wasn't looking for it. She paused. I was a little looking for it. I picked it up, turned it over. It was slightly warmer in tone, more cream than ivory, which would shift the light just barely. Let's try it, I said. We put it on together. I held the base. She fitted the shade. When I plugged it back in and the light came on, she stood in the same spot she'd stood 15 years ago in this same room. When she was 27, and the lamp was new and everything was beginning. And she said, that's still the exact color a room should feel like at night. I stood next to her looking at the light. Yeah, I said, it is. She moved back in quietly in April. No announcement, no ceremony. One weekend her things migrated from the River Arts District by degrees. A box of ceramics, her guitar on its stand, a small succulent she'd been keeping on her windowsill. The pottery wheel stayed in her studio downstairs in the collective, because she'd decided she needed a space that was hers alone. Not ours, not the house's, hers, and I thought that was the right call, and told her so. The apartment above the printmaker's stayed in her name. Derek went quiet eventually. His attorney's letters stopped. A mutual contact mentioned something about an audit from the county related to a renovation project he'd permitted incorrectly. Ray raised an eyebrow when I mentioned it, in the satisfied way of someone who believes the universe runs on a justice schedule that simply requires patience. Some mornings I wake up at 5 and the workshop is cold, and Hitch is taking up 70% of the bed, and the maple is just starting to go light outside, and I can hear from the living room, the lamp. Not the sound of it. Lamps don't make sounds, but its presence, the fact of it, the warm weight it adds to the room. Some mornings, Naomi is already up, coffee, her own mug on the counter beside mine, not the green ceramic one from the car. She gave that one to her sister. She made herself a new one in November. During the months she was building herself back. Small, slightly tall. A glaze that shifts between gray and blue depending on the light, a little uneven at the rim in the way she described once as meaning a thing has been held. The two mugs sit beside each other every morning. Her gray-blue one made by her own hands. My old one from the shop on Lexington chipped on one side. Bought the afternoon I ran out of reasons to keep standing at her table. Every morning I pour coffee into both, and the quiet between us this time is the kind we built on purpose. If you've ever held on to something small from someone, not because you forgot to throw it away, but because some part of you knew the story wasn't finished, this one's for you. What's your lamp? Leave it in the comments. I read everyone.